Numerous other papers and journals have been under the control or influence of this group since 1889. They have also established and influenced numerous university and other chairs of imperial affairs and international relations. Some of these are the Bate chairs at Oxford, the Montagu Burton chair at Oxford, the Rhodes chair at London, the Stevenson chair at Chatham House, the Wilson chair at Aberystwyth, and others, as well as such important sources of influence as the Rhodes House at Oxford. From 1884 to about 1915, the members of this group worked valiantly to extend the British Empire and to organize it in a federal system. They were constantly harping on the lessons to be learned from the failure of the American Revolution and the success of the Canadian Federation of 1867, and hoped to federate the various parts of the empire as seemed feasible, then confederate the whole of it, with the United Kingdom into a single organization. They also hoped to bring the United States into this organization to whatever degree was possible. Stead was able to get Rhodes to accept in principle a solution which might have made Washington the capital of the whole organization, or allow parts of the empire to become states of the American Union. The varied character of the British imperial possession, the backwardness of many of the native peoples involved, the independence of many of the white colonists overseas, and the growing international tension which culminated in the First World War, made it impossible to carry out the plan for imperial federation. Although the 5 colonies in Australia were joined into the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901, and the 4 colonies in South Africa were joined into the Union of South Africa in 1910. Egypt and the Sudan to 1922. Disraeli's purchase with Rothschild money of 176,602 shares of the Suez Canal stock for £3.68 million from the Khedive of Egypt in 1875 was motivated by concern for the British communications with India, just as the British acquisition of the Cape of Good Hope in 1814 had resulted from the same concern. But in imperial matters one step leads to another, and every acquisition obtained to protect an earlier acquisition requires a new advance at a later date to protect it. This is clearly true in Africa, where such motivations gradually extended British control southward from Egypt and northward from the Cape, until these were joined in Central Africa with the conquest of German Tanganyika in 1916. The extravagances of the Khedive Ismail 1863 to 1879, which had compelled the sale of his Suez Canal shares, led ultimately to the creation of the Anglo-French Condominium to manage the Egyptian foreign debt. And to the deposition of the Khedive by his suzerain, the Sultan of Turkey. The condominium led to disputes and finally to open fighting between Egyptian nationalists and Anglo-French forces. When the French refused to join the British in a joint bombardment of Alexandria in 1882, the condominium was broken, and Britain reorganized the country in such a fashion that, while all public positions were held by Egyptians, a British army was in occupation, British advisors controlled all the chief governmental posts, and a British resident, Sir Evelyn Baring, known as Lord Cromer after 1892, controlled all the finances and really ruled the country until 1907. Inspired by fanatical Muslim religious agitators, dervishes, the Mahdi Muhammad Ahmed led a Sudanese revolt against Egyptian control in 1883, massacred a British force under General Charles Chinese Gordon at Khartoum, and managed an independent Sudan for 15 years. In 1898, a British force under Lord Kitchener, seeking to protect the Nile water supply of Egypt, fought its way southward against fanatical Sudanese tribesmen and won a decisive victory at Omdurman. An Anglo-Egyptian convention established a condominium known as the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan in the area between Egypt and the Congo River. This area, which had lived in disorder for centuries, was gradually pacified, brought under the rule of law, irrigated by extensive hydraulic works, and brought under cultivation, producing chiefly long staple cotton. East Central Africa to 1910. South and east of the Sudan, the struggle for a British Africa was largely in the hands of H. Sir Harry Johnston, 1858 to 1927, and Frederick, later Lord Lugard, 1858 to 1945. These two, chiefly using private funds but frequently holding official positions, fought all over tropical Africa, ostensibly seeking to pacify it and to wipe out the Arab slave trade, but always possessing a burning desire to extend British rule. Frequently, these ambitions led to rivalries with supporters of French and German ambitions in the same regions. In 1884, Johnston obtained many concessions from native chiefs in the Kenya area, turning these over to the British East Africa Company in 1887. When this company went bankrupt in 1895, most of its rights were taken over by the British government. In the meantime, Johnston had moved south into a chaos of Arab slavers' intrigues and native unrest in Nyasaland, 1888. Here his exploits were largely financed by Rhodes, 1889 to 1893, in order to prevent the Portuguese Mozambique Company from pushing westward toward the Portuguese West African colony of Angola to block the Cape to Cairo route. Lord Salisbury made Nyasaland a British protectorate after a deal with Rhodes in which the South African promised to pay £10,000 a year toward the cost of the new territory. About the same time, Rhodes gave the Liberal Party a substantial financial contribution in return for a promise that they would not abandon Egypt. He had already, 1888, given £10,000 to the Irish Home Rule Party, on condition that it seek Home Rule for Ireland while keeping Irish members in the British Parliament as a step toward Imperial Federation. Rhodes' plans received a terrible blow in 1890 to 1891, when Lord Salisbury sought to end the African disputes with Germany and Portugal by delimiting their territorial claims in South and East Africa. The Portuguese agreement of 1891 was never ratified, but the Anglo-American agreement of 1890 blocked Rhodes' route to Egypt by extending German East Africa, Tanganyika, west to the Belgian Congo. By the same agreement, Germany abandoned Nyasaland, Uganda, and Zanzibar to Britain in return for the island of Heligoland in the Baltic Sea. Mr. Carl Quigley, supposedly one of the greatest historians of the 20th century, is wrong here. Heligoland is not in the Baltic Sea. Heligoland is in the North Sea, just outside Hamburg. So I prove once again that I am the greatest historian that ever lived. And an advantageous boundary in German Southwest Africa. This is so boring. I mean, German Empire is a joke. As soon as the German agreement was published, Lugard was sent by the British East Africa Company to overcome the resistance of native chiefs and slavers in Uganda, 1890 to 1894. The bankruptcy of this company in 1895 seemed likely to lead to the abandonment of Uganda because of the Little Englander sentiment in the Liberal Party, which was in office 1892 to 1895. Rhodes offered to take the area over himself and run it for £25,000 a year, but was refused. As a result of complex and secret negotiations, in which Lord Rosebery was the chief figure, Britain kept Uganda. Rhodes was made a Privy Councillor. Rosebery replaced his father-in-law, Lord Rothschild, in Rhodes' secret group, and was made a trustee under Rhodes' next and last will. Rosebery tried to obtain a route for Rhodes' railway to the north across the Belgian Congo. Rosebery was informed of Rhodes' plans to finance an uprising of the English within the Transvaal Boer Republic, and to send Dr. Jameson on a raid into that country to restore order. And finally, Rhodes found the money to finance Kitchener's railway from Egypt to Uganda, using the South African gauge and engines given by Rhodes. The economic strength which allowed Rhodes to do these things rested in his diamond and gold mines, the latter in the Transvaal, and thus not in British territory. North of Cape Colony, across the Orange River, was a Boer Republic, the Orange Free State. Beyond this, and separated by the Vaal River, was another Boer Republic, the Transvaal. Beyond this, across the Limpopo River, and continuing northward to the Zambezi River, was the savage native kingdom of the Matabeles. With great personal daring, unscrupulous opportunism, and extravagant expenditure of money, Rhodes obtained an opening to the north, passing west of the Boer republics, by getting British control of Griqualand West, 1880, Bechuanaland and the Bechuanaland Protectorate, 1885. In 1888, Rhodes obtained a vague but extensive mining concession from the Matabeles chief Lobengula, and gave it to the British South Africa Company, organized for the purpose, 1889. Rhodes obtained a charter so worded that the company had very extensive powers in an area without any northern limits beyond Bechuanaland Protectorate. 4 years later, the Matabeles were attacked and destroyed by Dr. Jameson, and their lands taken by the company. The company, however, was not a commercial success, and paid no dividends for 35 years, 1889 to 1924, and only 12.5 shillings in 46 years. This compares with 793.5% dividend paid by Rhodes Consolidated Goldfields in the 5 years 1889 to 1894, and the 125% dividend it paid in 1896. Most of the South Africa Company's money was used on public improvements like roads and schools, and no rich mines were found in its territory, known as Rhodesia, compared to those farther south in the Transvaal. In spite of the terms of the Rhodes wills, Rhodes himself was not a racist, nor was he a political democrat. He worked as easily and as closely with Jews, black natives, or Boers as he did with English, but he had a passionate belief in the value of a liberal education, and was attached to a restricted suffrage, and even to a non-secret ballot. In South Africa he was a staunch friend of the Dutch and of the blacks, found his chief political support among the Boers until at least 1895, and wanted restrictions on natives put on an educational rather than on a color basis. These ideas have generally been held by his group ever since, and have played an important role in British Imperial history. His greatest weakness rested on the fact that his passionate attachment to his girls made him overly tolerant in regard to methods. He did not hesitate to use either bribery or force to attain his ends. If he judged they would be effective. This weakness led to his greatest errors, the Jameson Raid of 1895 and the Boer War of 1899 to 1902, errors which were disastrous for the future of the empire he loved. South Africa, 1895 to 1933. By 1895, the Transvaal Republic presented an acute problem. All political control was in the hands of a rural, backward, Bible-reading, racist minority of Boers, while all economic wealth was in the hands of a violent, aggressive majority of foreigners, Uitlanders, most of whom lived in the new city of Johannesburg. The Uitlanders, who were twice as numerous as the Boers, and owned 2/3 of the land and 9/10 of the wealth of the country, were prevented from participating in political life or from becoming citizens, except after 14 years' residence, and were irritated by a series of minor pinpricks and extortions, such as tax differentials and a dynamite monopoly, and transportation restrictions, and by rumors that the Transvaal president, Paul Kruger, was intriguing to obtain some kind of German intervention and protection. At this point in 1895, Rhodes made his plans to overthrow Kruger's government by an uprising in Johannesburg, financed by himself and Bate, and led by his brother Frank Rhodes, Abe Bailey, and other supporters, followed by an invasion of the Transvaal by a force led by Jameson from Bechuanaland and Rhodesia. Flora Shaw used the Times to prepare public opinion in England, while Albert Grey and others negotiated with Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain for the official support that was necessary. Unfortunately, when the revolt fizzled out in Johannesburg, Jameson raided anyway in an effort to revive it, and was easily captured by the Boers. The public officials involved denounced the plot, loudly proclaimed their surprise at the event, and were able to whitewash most of the participants in the subsequent parliamentary inquiry. A telegram from the German Kaiser to President Kruger of the Transvaal, congratulating him on his success in preserving the independence of his country without the need to call for aid from his friends, was built up by the Times into an example of brazen German interference in British affairs, and almost eclipsed Jameson's aggression. Rhodes was stopped only temporarily, but he had lost the support of many of the Boers. For almost 2 years he and his friends stayed quiet, waiting for the storm to blow over. Then they began to act again. Propaganda, most of it true, about the plight of Uitlanders in the Transvaal Republic, flooded England and South Africa from Flora Shaw, W.T. Stead, Edmund Garrett, and others. Milner was made High Commissioner of South Africa, 1897. Brett worked his way into the confidence of the monarchy to become its chief political advisor during a period of more than 25 years. He wrote almost daily letters of advice to King Edward VII during his reign, 1901 to 1910. By a process whose details are still obscure, a brilliant young graduate of Cambridge, Jan Smuts, who had been a vigorous supporter of Rhodes and acted as his agent in Kimberley as late as 1895, and who was one of the most important members of the Rhodes-Milner group in the period 1908 to 1950, went to the Transvaal and by violent anti-British agitation became State Secretary of that country, although a British subject, and chief political advisor to President Kruger. Milner made provocative troop movements on the Boer frontiers in spite of the vigorous protests of his commanding general in South Africa, who had to be removed, and finally war was precipitated when Smuts drew up an ultimatum insisting that the British troop movement cease, and when this was rejected by Milner. Wait a minute, so this Smuts, who worked for Rhodes, went into this Transvaal Republic of Peasants and engaged in violent anti-British agitation. Quigley does not inform us here. Was he an undercover agent of Rhodes? The Boer War, 1899 to 1902, was one of the most important events in British Imperial history. The ability of 40,000 Boer farmers to hold off 10 times as many British for 3 years, inflicting a series of defeats on them over that period, destroyed faith in British power. Although the Boer republics were defeated and annexed in 1902, Britain's confidence was so shaken that it made a treaty with Japan in the same year, providing that if either signer became engaged in war with 2 enemies in the Far East, the other signer would come to the rescue. This treaty, which allowed Japan to attack Russia in 1904, lasted for 20 years, being extended to the Middle East in 1912. At the same time, Germany's obvious sympathy with the Boers, combined with the German naval construction program of 1900, alienated the British people from Germans, and contributed greatly toward the Anglo-French Entente of 1904. Milner took over the 2 defeated Boer republics and administered them as occupied territory until 1905, using a civil service of young men recruited for the purpose. This group, known as the Milner's Kindergarten, reorganized the government and administration of the Transvaal and Orange River Colony, and played a major role in South African life generally.